Good morning. Local elections don't always seem very consequential, but the set of elections that we've just had across the United Kingdom could have very big consequences for the future of the Prime Minister and the very makeup of the country that he leads. Well, in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin won the most votes and the most seats in the Assembly, and it means that there are now real questions about its future in the United Kingdom. North of the border in Great Britain, the SNP managed to take even more seats ahead of a possible independence referendum there next year. And meanwhile, given losses in Scotland, Wales and particularly the south of England, many in the Conservative Party will be reflecting on whether Boris Johnson really is the man to lead them into the next general election. Lots to discuss with our guests this morning. Well, for the Conservatives, we'll be talking to the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary Dominic Raab. For Labour, we'll be joined by Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy. Meanwhile, it was a pretty good night for the Lib Dems. They took seats from the Conservatives in the south. So we'll be talking to the party's deputy leader, Daisy Cooper. And what about those Conservatives considering Boris Johnson's future? We'll also hear from senior Tory MP Tom Tugendhat. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine continues, of course, and as Finland considers a historic application to join NATO, we'll be talking to the country's ambassador to the UK, Jukka Siukosaari. Well, there is no doubt that Thursday was a bad night for the Conservatives. The party lost almost 500 councillors and 11 councils. And those losses were, of course, to Labour in London and to the Liberal Democrats in the south. And if, and it's a big if, of course, the sort of voting that we saw is replicated in the upcoming general election, the Conservatives would lose their majority in Parliament. So what does the Prime Minister do now, once again, to reset his government? We're joined now by his deputy and the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. I'm keen, of course, to get to those local election results, but I just want to start off with what's happening in Northern Ireland, because it does feel like quite an astonishing story. Sinn Féin winning that historic victory, sending their first minister to the Northern Ireland Assembly. What's your reaction?
Well, look, there is clearly some change in Northern Ireland. I think, above all, what we want to see as the UK government is some stability. I think for the people of Northern Ireland, whichever way they voted, we want to see an executive formed, the parties to come together to provide the people of Northern Ireland with that stability. I think it's equally clear that that stability is being put at risk, imperilled, if you like, by the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's something that affects communities across the board. And it's clear from the dynamic we now see that we won't get to that position of stability until and unless it's fixed. And so we're focused on those two elements, bringing the parties together, stability, but also unlocking the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Unlocking the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. You sound as if this is something that you've got no control over. This Northern Ireland Protocol was what you imposed. Well, if it had been implemented with the kind of flexibility, goodwill and with the business interests of communities across Northern Ireland, and it hadn't been used, frankly, as a political device in the way that it has, I don't think we'd have the same level of problems. But the point of discussing that has passed. We must see it now fixed. The government is committed to fixing it. And we won't get the stability that I talked about, the political stability. Yeah. And that's clear as a result of the outcome of the elections in Northern Ireland. It's very clear, isn't it? The DUP leader has said that effectively they are not going to, they'll collapse power sharing. They won't form part of the executive until the UK government deals with the protocol. This is what Jeffrey Donaldson said. The protocol is harming our political process. It is undermining political stability. I made clear during this election that the government needs to sort that out. And until they do, I will not be nominating a minister to the executive. I just want to sort of pause and reflect on how serious that is. You know, the executive can't function otherwise. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Well, there hasn't been an executive for some time, as you know, Sophie. So we want to see an executive up and running. We want to see the parties come together in the kind of cooperation that can make that happen. So and when you look at the protocol in the Queen's speech, I just want to get a bit of a timeline on this. The Queen's speech next week, is the protocol going to be looked at then? Well, you know that I can't reveal details of the Queen's speech in advance, but what I would say is, first of all, we want to see an executive that can serve the people of Northern Ireland, the bread and butter issues of of which, of course, during the local elections in Northern Ireland, many people have been voting on, as well as other issues. But it's clear the Northern Ireland Protocol must be fixed. The Foreign Secretary's talked about it, the Prime Minister's talked about it, and that cannot be put off. Because we won't get the stability that we want, we won't get the executive that the people of Northern Ireland need until it is dealt with.
So how are you going to deal with it?
Well, look, preferably by negotiation, but if not, we'll have to take the measures to make sure that the economic integrity of the trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain, and frankly, the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom is protected and preserved. And we've talked about that. We set out a series of measures, so this isn't a new conundrum or problem. Brandon Lewis and the Prime Minister set out in a command paper the kinds of things that we would need to see happen. But we will deal with the situation. We will take whatever measures are necessary to protect, as I said, the economic as well as the constitutional integrity of Northern Ireland. But fundamentally, that Northern Ireland Protocol is not working for communities right across the piece in Northern Ireland. And you hear that from businesses and from communities across the political spectrum. So it does need to be fixed.
So you do it unilaterally without the EU if necessary?
Oh, we've been clear that that option has not been taken off the table. We prefer to get it resolved through negotiation. That's why we've been through a protracted period to try and get it fixed through negotiation. But of course, as you know, there are measures that we can take to make sure that we deal with the problem. We can't put it off. And it's clear now, and in fact, if anything, the outcome in Northern Ireland from those elections makes it clear it cannot be put off. And
you say it can't be put off. What kind of time frame are we talking about here?
Well, I don't want to jump the gun because then that will lead all the headlines. I think it needs to be dealt with very responsibly, but we've been talking about...
Are you talking weeks? Are we talking months? What?
No longer than that. It must be dealt with.
No longer than...
Weeks and months. That can span a long period of time. I do not want to escalate some of the tensions that we're seeing. I want to de-escalate them, and that means encouraging the parties to come together. It was interesting to see the results across the board, in particular, for example, the results of the Alliance, which very much campaigned across community divides on bread and butter local issues. I think that's what the people of Northern Ireland want to see focused. But the problem is the stability that allows a Northern Ireland executive to get up and running, allows the elected politicians to serve those communities, can't happen until we unlock and fix the Northern Ireland Protocol.
OK. I want to talk to you a bit about the potential of a border poll as well. Sinn Féin, of course, the largest party, they are obviously would have to enter a power-sharing agreement. But this is what the president of Sinn Féin said, Mary Lou MacDonald, the president of Sinn Féin. She said, I believe the referendum, and this is on a united Ireland, I believe the referendum would be possible within a 5-year time frame. But much more importantly, I believe the preparation needs to start now. Well,
it's quite a caveated statement, but the point I'd make is that if you look at the results in Northern Ireland, 58% fully of people voted either for parties who support the Union or for parties who do not support constitutional change. And that is the message from the people of Northern Ireland.
But what is the UK government position on a border poll?
Well, look, we don't have an executive yet. I think the first priority, as I said, mindful of that 58% of people in Northern Ireland who are not calling for that kind of change, is to get the executive up and running, get the stability, bring the parties together and make sure we fix the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think, frankly, that is what the people of Northern Ireland will expect right now.
OK. I'm keen to talk about some of the election results elsewhere now, in England, Scotland and Wales. And just to get a bit of a picture of what happened with the Conservative Party. So this is what happened in England. And I'm focusing on the blue column here, the Conservatives. You lost 339 seats in England alone. We can go on to Scotland. In Scotland, you lost 62 seats in Scotland, hard-won seats in Scotland, of course, under Ruth Davidson. And in Wales, you lost 56 seats in Wales as well. This is a pretty disastrous set of results.
Well, look, they're challenging for any government mid-term. We see these kind of...
I'm just going to come in. You say that it's challenging for any government mid-term, right? The Conservatives have been in power for 12 years.
Yeah.
When Gordon Brown was in power after 12 years in office, he lost 291 councillors, a lot better than you, and also we all know what happens next. I don't think it's fair to just write this off as mid-term results.
No, I'm not. I take it very seriously. I know I was out on the doorstep myself. I know the kind of issues that were raised, and they're, of course, very varied. But all I'd say is, if you look at Keir Starmer's result in these local elections, yes, they've been difficult for us. but he did worse than, for example, Ed Miliband in 2012, no cut through really beyond London. We have had a mixed bag of results, there's no sugarcoating it, but we've also got areas in the north, from Hartlepool, Barnsley to Bolton, and in the south, whether it's Basildon or Thurrock, where we've done better than expected. So yes, it's been a difficult set of results, but I think the real story coming out of all of this, and politicians will be going on all the Sunday shows making their pitch.
Picking all the different councils where they've done better.
Exactly. So let me quote two very impartial people, Sir John Curtis and Professor Michael Thrasher, who said respectively that Labour's performance was not making significant progress, and Thrasher said that it was not good enough in making a real dent in a Conservative majority. So the independent experts say that.
I will talk about Labour's performance with our next guest, Lisa Nandy, and I'm keen to talk about the Conservative performance with you, because as you know, it's not just Labour, it's the Lib Dems who took a lot of seats.
Yeah, true.
And I'm going to quote an impartial observer, if you like. I'll quote the Daily Mail. This is the Daily Mail. This is what would success look like at the local elections for the Conservatives and Labour. And you can see there in the top left corner, more than 350 losses. They're clocking up as a disaster for the Conservatives.
Yes, but look, what people vote in a set of mid-term local elections and what they vote when you choose a government in general election are two wholly different things.
I'm accepting that, but this is what the Daily Mail claim that would be a disaster in these local elections for the Conservatives. What would be the word you would use to describe them?
Mixed bag. Well, a mixed bag, challenging.
Mixed bag?
Yeah.
Are you a bit complacent here?
Well, no, I'm Sophie, I'm not. I'm pointed to the areas where we've done better than expected. Even in London, which was a very difficult set of results for us, there's areas like the Croydon Mayoralty, there's areas like Harlow, where we've and other areas where actually it has been uneven. I don't think you can take a single view other than to say London under Keir Starmer looks very much a metropolitan party which has got appeal in London but not beyond to the rest of the country. What we're going to be focusing on this week is what our plans are to drive up the economy, protect the cost of living. We're going to be talking about reform in the agricultural sector, innovation to create cheaper, healthier food. We're going to be talking about areas where Britain has a real comparative advantage, tech, financial services.
Does there need to be a bit of a reset, do you think, then, in the Queen's speech?
I don't think it's a reset. Look, clearly, when you have mid-term local elections, there's a lot of protest votes out there. There's a message that we must heed, particularly about not focusing on Westminster, but focusing on them. The cost of living problem challenge is going to be there for the next year.
Do you accept you need to do more on the cost of living?
Well, look, we're doing a huge amount, but we've got £22 billion of support that's going in. We've got the extra money that's going to be coming through in July with the national insurance threshold being raised.
Do you accept you need to do more?
We are doing more. That's what I'm saying. In July, the national insurance threshold will be raised. That's extra money in people's pockets. We've got the council tax relief, the energy bills relief. But the point I was making earlier, if you look at the kinds of things we're going to be talking about on the economy in the weeks ahead, from agriculture to financial services and tech, all areas where we've got a great comparative advantage. We're the ones, the Conservative government, with a plan to drive up the job-creating wealth that we need those businesses to create, which also provides the tax revenue that we're funneling in through this £22 billion package to help people who are genuinely finding it hard to make ends meet. Labour, under Keir Starmer, are going to spend the rest of the week talking about the curry menu and the beer that he did or didn't have up in Durham. We're the ones with a plan to address these cost of living challenges.
I want to just have a look at how the Conservatives are doing in the South now.
Sure.
Because obviously, one of the big threats for you is the apparent resurgence of the Lib Dems in the South. Now, this is the Sky News analysis. It's the average change in vote share in the South. It's the top one there. You can see down 5.9% in the South. The Lib Dems, of course, are up in the South. And I know you want to talk about Labour, but I'm not interested in talking about Labour at this point. We can talk about Labour with Labour, right? This is about the Lib Dems and the Conservatives in the South. Your seat's in the South.
Yep.
If we had swings like this, you'd lose your seat at the next election.
Look, it's going to be a tough fight for me in my seat. Although, actually, I'd just point out, in the council, we still have more seats than the Liberal Democrats on that council. What you're seeing here, and the Lib Dems have often done it, history shows, they're a repository for some protest vote mid-term. And although you don't want to talk about Labour, that's precisely because Labour are doing so poorly in the rest of England outside London. But what people want us to see is get focused on those things that I talked about. And that's why the plans that we're talking about to drive up innovation in the tech, the agricultural sector, in financial services, doesn't just create the well-paid jobs of the future, it creates the tax revenue so that those that are really feeling the pinch, we can provide that extra support. We're the ones with the plan, and that's what we're going to be talking about
over the next few weeks. Focusing on the red wall, you've taken your eye off what's happening in your blue wall, in traditional southern conservative heartlands like your own?
I've always said it's a balance. You've got to knit an alliance between the aspirational working and middle classes, but that's what we're focused on. And that's why we're the ones, as I said, with the plan for the cost of living, whether it's the universal credit taper.
You've spoken about this.
We have, but we're the ones with the plan. We're going to be talking about that this week, whereas I think you're going to find Keir Starmer wrapped up in Beergate and Durham and the double standards on the Labour Party.
We're
getting off that.
I'm going to ask you about Keir Starmer because I think you do want to talk about it, which is why you've referenced it twice now.
But it's the contrast.
So do you think that Keir Starmer needs to resign now that he's being investigated by the police, which is what he said Boris Johnson, of course, and Rishi Sunak should do?
Well, Sophie, it's the rank double standards that drives people crazy. He needs to fess up and answer all of the holes in the account that he gave of that beer and curry event in Durham. But frankly, I'm not focused on that, and that's why I wanted to draw the contrast. What we're focused on, what this government is focused on, is the measures we're taking on the economy, on tech, on the agricultural sector, our farmers, brilliant innovation to be done there, financial services to drive up the well-paid jobs of the future, but also, and this is where only the Conservatives offer, a plan for a dynamic economy that doesn't just create the jobs, but the tax revenue to support people at this difficult time.
Does Keir Starmer need to consider his position?
I'm not getting into all that because, frankly, I'll tell you the thing I heard on the doorstep loud and clear. They want politicians focused on their issues, not Westminster. But what I would say about it is Keir Starmer looks like, I'm afraid, someone who's engaged in complete hypocrisy, complete double standards. And I don't think he's going to get past that until he gives a proper account of what happened in Durham.
OK, I mean, Labour had said that they have explained what happened in Durham, and they said that they're very, very confident that they, unlike the Prime Minister, they won't be found to have broken the law. But as you say, let's talk about other issues that people are interested about. Now, I spoke to David Simmons, the Conservative MP, earlier this week. He said the number one issue on the doorstep was Partygate and the Prime Minister's conduct. And he spoke about how frustrated he was that the actions of one individual were coming up and that councillors had been lost as a result. And he said that, frankly, he's going to be listening to what the Prime Minister says and working out whether or not he has confidence in his leadership going forward. How worried are you that there will be Conservative MPs thinking, look, hang on a minute, we might be putting in those letters of no confidence?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, look, I respect all of my colleagues, and they make their points. And I also feel for the Conservative candidates that lost their seats or didn't win their seats. I had one who missed out by just 12 votes, which is very frustrating. I feel for all of them. But the reality is, I think, coming through these local elections, there was no cut-through for Labour and Keir Starmer. And what we've got to do as a team... Yeah, no, I get it. But what we've got to do as a team, from our councillors to our MPs to our government and with the leadership of the PM, is get focused on those bread and butter issues people care about. And that's why...
Don't you think, though, genuinely...
Sorry, that's why I come back to what we're going to be talking about over the next month. How to drive up the well-paid jobs of the future, but also, critically, if you've got a dynamic economy, to pay for the tax revenue that's going to provide the support for people with the cost of living. That's the crucial issue. We're talking about it. None of the other parties are talking about it.
I just wonder if, people like David Simmons listening to your interview saying that, oh, yeah, these results were a mixed bag, they're going to think the people in Cabinet just don't get it. No, complacent.
Look, I've seen it for myself. We had difficult results in Elmbridge, in the home counties they were. But I also think we need to be sober about this. We need to recognise that midterm elections are difficult and critically, that the Labour Party has had very little cut-through outside London. So there's a job to do, but that job is not engaged in navel-gazing in Westminster. It's about addressing the policy platform of everything we're doing on the economy, on jobs and on the cost of living. And that's what you're going to hear. That's what the government is going to be setting out in the weeks ahead.
Is Boris Johnson still an asset electorally for the Conservative Party?
I'm confident that he can and will win the next election. But that's not something that you just assert. You've got to back it up. And that's why we come back to the measures that we're going to be talking about on the economy, also on the NHS, on social care, but critically, the relief that only the Conservatives with a dynamic economy can provide people who are feeling the pinch of the cost of living. You won't get that with the others.
So Boris Johnson will lead the Conservative Party into the next election then?
Yes.
OK, Dominic Raab, thank you very much indeed.
Good to talk to you.
Now, we've been talking about those difficult election results for the Conservatives, or a mixed bag, depending on your perspective there. And we're going to talk about Labour's performance with our next guest as well. But there are also, as we were discussing, some questions about the future of Keir Starmer's leadership, because Durham police are investigating whether he broke COVID rules by having a curry with party workers after a day of campaigning. Well, the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy, joins us now from Salford. Thank you very much for being with us. As I said, we will get to those local election results in just a moment. But first, let's talk about Keir Starmer. More allegations in the newspapers this morning. The Sunday Times claiming that sources say Keir Starmer didn't do work after eating, as he claimed. The Mail on Sunday has got a leaked memo, which it claims shows the event and the curry was planned in advance, this dinner in Miners Hall with Mary Foy, the candidate. Now, Labour, of course, say no rules are broken. They're happy to answer any questions. So can you just tell us exactly what happened? You know, was the event planned in advance? Was work done afterwards? What actually went on?
Well, I think this note, the operations note that the Mail on Sunday has got hold of, demonstrates exactly what went on, was exactly what Keir Starmer has said went on. He went on a work visit. He stopped to eat at various times during the day, as was factored into the work visit. And then he finished the work visit and he went back to his hotel. I think the last few weeks we've seen an absolutely desperate attempt to sling mud at the Labour leader and various members of the Labour Party, and it is frankly absurd of the Tories to claim that this in any way equates to a Prime Minister who was under investigation by the police for 12 separate gatherings, which included karaoke parties, bring your own bottle parties, pub quizzes, suitcases full of wine being smuggled through the back door. And the Prime Minister lied about that. He denied that they happened. He denied that he was there. He came clean and he laughed about it. Keir Starmer went on a work visit and had a break to eat. The idea that this is the same sort of thing is just a sign of a government that is tired, is desperate and is completely out of ideas, that spends more time slinging mud at the Labour Party than working out how they're going to deal with pensioners who are now struggling so much to heat their homes that they're having to get on buses in order to avoid the cold. It's about time that this government just gave up with this desperate attempt and went for the sake of this country.
OK, well, let's just put to one side any comparisons with Boris Johnson or what happened in number 10 Downing Street. Let's just put that to one side. Keir Starmer is being investigated by the police about whether or not he broke the law. If they find that he broke the law, should he resign?
Look, I'm not going to get into that because I'm absolutely confident that he hasn't broken the law.
But
he was investigated.
Why won't you get into it? I genuinely, sorry to interrupt you, but I am struggling to understand why nobody will engage in this legitimate question when Keir Starmer is literally under investigation by the police. If you're so confident, I understand that. You know, if Labour says, look, we're absolutely confident no rules were broken. If they were, of course he'll resign. But, you know, why don't you just be clear on what that is? I don't understand.
Because it lends legitimacy to something that is completely and utterly absurd, that is a desperate attempt by the government to deflect from the fact that we've got the highest inflation rate in a generation and people are struggling to survive. And I'm not going to entertain it because I'm absolutely confident that no rules were broken, not least because this was investigated last time the Conservatives tried to sling mud at us and Keir Starmer was found to be completely in the clear. This is a guy who self-isolated 6 times during the pandemic. I don't know a single other person who did that. He is Mr. Rules. He does not break the rules. He was the Director of Public Prosecutions, not somebody who goes round tearing up rules when it suits him. In stark contrast to the Prime Minister, I have to say, I think this desperate attempt to sling mud will fall flat, but I think we'll see more of this as we get closer to a general election because the one thing that the Conservatives don't want to talk about is what is actually happening to people in this country right now, and that's what we're focused on.
The easiest way to shut down these questions and to focus on the issues you want is just to give a straight answer about what would happen if Durham police find Mr. Rules did break the rules. And we know, of course, why we're talking about this, because he has been, as you say, very strong in criticising the government and in calling on them to resign. I just want to look at a tweet from Keir Starmer at the end of January. After months of denials, the Prime Minister is now under criminal investigation for breaking his own lockdown laws. He needs to do the decent thing and resign. Now, the crucial thing about this is the date. This is before any fines were issued. Your leader is now under investigation for breaking lockdown laws. Surely, if you have his own standards applied to him, then Keir Starmer needs to resign just for being under investigation.
But Sophie, look, I've already answered that question. That tweet that called for Boris Johnson to resign was at a time when the Prime Minister was under investigation for 12 separate gatherings at Downing Street, which he denied for months had even happened, let alone that he was there, and only came clean when he was caught red-handed. That included karaoke parties, bring your own bottle parties, leaving drinks, celebration drinks, suitcases full of wine being smuggled in through the back door of Downing Street. It is absurd to equate that to a work visit with planned breaks to eat. It was not illegal to eat. And the longer that this goes on, the reason that we're talking about it is not because Labour won't answer a straight answer. The reason we're talking about it is because this government is desperate and they are throwing mud at the Labour Party to deflect from their own failings in the country. And the longer that we talk about this and the less that we talk about what is happening to people in the country, the more it fuels the sense that politicians are out of touch. And that's what Boris Johnson wants. And we're determined not to allow him to do it.
OK, you're very clear in your answers that you don't think Keir Starmer will be found guilty. If he does, it is hard to see how he could potentially stay on as leader. If the ball, to coin a phrase, did come loose at the back of the scrum, would you fancy having another crack at the leadership?
Look, I stood to be leader of the Labour Party because I believe that our nations and regions across Britain had been fundamentally underserved for decades, and we needed to turn that around. We need to get good jobs back into towns like Wigan and across the country, and we need to start putting money in people's pockets and rebuilding our communities. That's the job that Keir Starmer has handed me. And for 12 years, I've just watched with absolute desperation as the Tories have visited misery on people across this country. That's why we've got to get into government and we've got to turn this around. You saw on Thursday that we're starting to do that we're starting to fight our way back in communities where people said it just wasn't possible only 3 years ago. And in a couple of years' time, that is our responsibility. We've got to be in government, get rid of this tired, desperate government and start to turn around the fortunes of the people in this country.
That sounded a little bit like another leadership pitch to me.
It's a pitch to the country that we need a Labour government led by Keir Starmer in a couple of years' time that is going to be able to get money back into people's pockets, deal with the immediate crisis and start to rebuild this country from the ground up. This country cannot afford more of the Conservatives, and there is absolutely no question in my mind that we can't muck around with internal debates in the Labour Party about who's up and who's down. We've got a leader who, even in these last few days, with huge amounts of mud being slung at him, has come out of this showing the same honesty and character and grit that he's shown all the way through during the leadership contest when we were competitors and since. And we are absolutely determined that we're going to stand together, fight together and win the future of this country together.
OK. Now, I am keen to talk about the local election results. We spoke to Dominic Raab about the difficult performance the Conservatives had. But I just want to look at Labour, because I accept that, progress was made in some areas by Labour, but you actually lost vote share in every part of the country apart from London. You also gained fewer seats than the Lib Dems and the Green Party in England. We're looking at the graph now. Labour putting on 28 seats in England. That's compared to 191 for the Lib Dems and the 61 for the Green Party. I mean, it's pretty clear, isn't it, by these results that people are unhappy with the Conservatives. But they're not necessarily just coming to Labour. Why not?
Well, 3 years ago, I came on your show after we'd just lost our entire Labour base in every nation and region of the UK. And I think you could see that it was clear. I honestly didn't know if that decisive break that people had made with us was going to be permanent. These are parts of the country where, like Bury, like Rossendale, like parts of Cumbria, where once we were them and they were us, and that break was painful and I wasn't sure if it was going to be permanent. I think Thursday showed the opposite, actually. I think it showed that the path back to power for Labour is steep, but it doesn't have to be long. And we're making progress in every region and nation now, in Scotland, in Wales and in England, in parts of the country where, I watched us lose Labour MPs, I watched us lose good people, and I wondered if we'd ever repair that damage. We did start to repair that damage on Thursday. This was the turning point for us, and I'm absolutely determined now that this is a start, not the end, that we now get on the front foot to convince people that we're not just an effective opposition who've won the right to be heard, but we are a genuine alternative to this awful Tory government that can actually start to deliver on the things that people care about, like getting money back into people's pockets through a windfall tax, like investing in good jobs in every community in this country. We've started to set that out, but you're going to see a lot more of that from me, from Keir, from Rachel Reeves and others over the next few months.
Do you think Labour needs to be much more bold, then, in the policy platform to deal with the cost of living crisis that's coming down the road?
I think we've been pretty bold so far. We've struck out at the last Labour Party conference by promising to invest $28 billion a year, every year, over the next decade in good, clean jobs in communities that have seen jobs bleeding out of those communities for the last 40 years. I think, we have a lot of debate in the Labour Party about whether to be radical. I think the key is to be relevant. People need money in their pockets right now. That's why we're calling for a windfall tax on the big oil and gas producers. We need to get that money back into their pockets, not just because families and businesses are struggling to survive, but because it's a nonsense to say, as Michael Gove is saying, that you can start to rebuild our economies and rebuild our high streets and town centres if people simply don't have money to spend. We care about the same things that people in this country care about. They're not getting a hearing at the moment in the media or the political debate, and it's our job to make sure that they do.
OK, I'm keen to talk to you about the situation in Northern Ireland as well, with Sinn Féin winning that historic victory in those Assembly elections. Now, Mary Lou MacDonald, the president of Sinn Féin, has already started talking about the possibility of a border poll, saying a referendum could be possible within a 5-year timeframe. What is the Labour Party's position on a border poll in Northern Ireland?
Well, look, we believe in the United Kingdom. We're not neutral about that. We fought for and will strive for and argue for the future of the United Kingdom for as long as we exist. We respect the Good Friday Agreement, and we would play our role in government as an honest broker in that. But look, I think these elections in Northern Ireland are historic and they are significant. It's very clear that people were voting for change in the last set of elections, but that does not equate to voting to trigger a border poll. The Good Friday Agreement is absolutely clear that there has to be a clear majority for that in Northern Ireland before that is triggered, and I don't think that those conditions have in any sense been met. Most of the major parties, including Sinn Féin, fought these elections on the cost of living crisis that is engulfing people in Northern Ireland just as it's engulfing people across the United Kingdom. We'll support Sinn Féin in their aim to get the executive up and running as quickly as possible. They hope to do that next week, and then to start focusing on the things that they won this election on, which is the cost of living crisis and getting money back into people's pockets.
And just finally, there's some real concerns about the ability to actually form an executive at all, with the DUP saying that they're prepared to collapse the power sharing arrangement, refuse to join an executive until the Northern Ireland Protocol is dealt with. Now, Dominic Raab earlier on the show said that it needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. What do you think needs to happen?
We've long been calling for a veterinary agreement that would help to break down some of those borders and barriers that currently exist because of the Northern Ireland Protocol that Boris Johnson negotiated. I think on a broader point, at any time in the history of Northern Ireland, recent history, when there's been a problem, it has usually fallen to the British Prime Minister to try to use his or her personal authority to bring sides together and to negotiate through this. The difficulty that we find ourselves in now is that Boris Johnson is not seen as an honest broker. He is the person who helped to write the architecture of this problem rather than resolve it. I think the key over the next couple of weeks for the government is that they've got to get on and resolve these issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol, because at the moment, I have to say, the lack of trust in the Prime Minister himself is part of what is fueling this crisis in Northern Ireland. So get that agreement in place, yes, and the nuts and bolts of it, but also Boris Johnson has a lot of work to do, I think, to prove to people in Northern Ireland that he can be trusted. OK,
Lisa Nandy, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Lisa Nandy there.
Thank you.
Well, as we've been talking about a lot on the programme today, one of the most significant, if not the most consequential of all, outcomes of Thursday's elections will be in Northern Ireland, where Sinn Féin, of course, got the highest share of the vote and also the largest number of Assembly seats for the first time. Well, there is nobody better to tell us about what that all means than our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins, who joins us now live. Thank you so much for being on the programme today, David. So how long have they got to form a government, and how is Northern Ireland governed if that executive can't be formed?
Well, until 2 years ago, Sophie, they would have had just 8 days to form a government before the new Assembly would have effectively collapsed. But because that system had resulted in so much stop-start politics in Northern Ireland, the frequent collapse or suspension of the Assembly, a new agreement was made, you will remember, in January 2020 by the then Northern Ireland Secretary Julian Smith and the Irish Foreign Affairs Minister Simon Coveney. It was the agreement that saw Stormont come back to life after a 3-year hiatus, at that point with Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill sharing power as First and Deputy First Minister. That agreement gives more space for them to try and solve their problems. 24 weeks, so 6 months effectively. And there's a lot of rumour, I have to say, whispering in DUP circles that they're going to keep pushing for changes on the Northern Ireland Protocol, that controversial border in the Irish Sea. And if they manage to achieve that, don't rule out the possibility that the Democratic Unionists would then allow this Assembly to collapse, triggering a fresh election, perhaps in December. It wouldn't be the first time that Northern Ireland's had 2 elections in quick succession, but that is a risky business for the DUP if they choose that route, given that many people here are more concerned about things like the cost of living than they are in the constitutional question of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom.
Really interesting to hear you talk about that. And we did, of course, talk about that with Dominic Raab as well, the possibility of the whole thing being collapsed over concerns over the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, he seemed to acknowledge that the UK government needs to move and change it in some ways. What do you think the DUP would need to hear from the Queen's speech next week?
Well, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson says he needs action, not words, and that's because they have lost trust in this government. Remember, Boris Johnson came to Northern Ireland when Theresa May was Prime Minister, addressed the DUP conference and told them no British Prime Minister could ever countenance a border in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And then a year later, as Prime Minister himself, he agreed to the Northern Ireland Protocol, establishing a border in the Irish Sea, and ever since has criticised the EU for really implementing what was agreed. Now, the Tory government will say the EU is implementing it politically and with no flexibility. But the reality is that Mr Raab's comments would suggest this government doesn't understand something. The fact that of the 90 people just elected to the new Northern Ireland Assembly, 54 of them are in favour of the protocol being implemented, perhaps with some changes. Only 36 are opposed to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So actually, if this government takes unilateral action to scrap the protocol, for example, they may actually make the business of attempting to form a power-sharing government here more difficult.
OK, David, thank you very much for the explanations. Great to talk to you this morning. David Blevins there. Now, as we were discussing, one of the biggest concerns for the Conservatives after Thursday's elections will be the ground loss to the Liberal Democrats in the south. And it means there might be some nervous Conservative MPs ahead of the next election, maybe even Dominic Raab himself. But just how confident should the Lib Dems be feeling? Well, we're now joined by the party's Deputy Leader, Daisy Cooper, who joins us now. Congratulations on your results. How confident are you that they could be replicated at a general election?
Well, we have had a fantastic set of election results, as you say, across England, Scotland and Wales. And we've seen a real revival in rural areas such as Somerset and Cumbria. And we've made real inroads into new areas in what we call our blue wall area, places like West Oxfordshire and Wimbledon and Esher and Walton and Harpenden, places where Liberal Democrats are currently in second place and where we want to target Conservative MPs at the next general election. Of course, we never ever take votes for granted, and so we will be working very hard over the coming months and years to ensure that we can win the support and votes of people in these areas.
Well, you've of course got the Tiverton and Honiton by-election coming up, that one triggered by the resignation of Neil Paris for watching pornography. Dominic Raab admitted he actually faces a tough fight in his seat as well at the next general election. In those two places specifically, are you confident that we could see Lib Dem MPs?
Well, certainly in Esher and Walton, which is Dominic Raab's seat, we have a very strong local government base now, and we're hopeful that that is a seat that we might be able to win at the next general election. And in Tiverton and Honiton, I think you can see that really across the whole of the southwest, actually, Liberal Democrats have a very strong history of being the key challengers to the Conservatives in that area, and we are starting to see a revival there. And if there's one message we can take from these local elections, it's that people are really fed up of being taken for granted in both of these places and many more places as well, whether it's the Partygate scandals, whether it's misleading Parliament, whether it's the cost of living crisis or running our health services into the ground. People are really sick and tired of being taken for granted.
Now, of course, it's important to qualify some of what we've been saying by the fact that these are local elections. People do vote very differently in a general election, tends to be for bigger parties. But what the results do point towards, according to the Sky News analysis as well, is a hung parliament with neither Labour or the Conservatives managing to get a majority. Would the Lib Dems be prepared to go into a coalition?
Well, the outcome of the next general election is entirely in the hands of the voters. We don't even know when the next general election is going to be. We don't know what the mood or the state of the country is going to be. But the message that we've got from these local elections is that people are really, really scared about the cost of living emergency that is happening right now.
Just to come in again on the possibility of a coalition, you won't rule out doing a coalition either with the Conservatives or with Labour then?
Our number one priority for the Liberal Democrats is ousting this Conservative government. We have no interest in doing a coalition with this Conservative government at all. We have said that we are second place to the Conservatives in around 80 seats around the country, and those are the areas where we will be targeting Conservative MPs, and we want to play a role in ousting them. But right now, there is a cost of living emergency.
Coalition with Labour?
Look, the outcome of the next general election is in the hands of the voters. Right now, what voters have been telling us over the last few days in the run-up to the local elections is that there is a cost of living emergency, which is why we want to see an emergency VAT cut in the Queen's speech. They are fed up with their health services being driven into the ground. People can't see their GPs.
So just to be crystal clear, then you won't rule out a coalition with the Labour Party?
Liberal Democrats have said that we want to win as many seats as possible off the Conservatives at the next general election. And one way or another, we would like to play a role in ousting this Conservative government. It's far too soon to say what that might look like or how that might work, but we would want to play a role in ousting this Conservative government. That's our number one priority.
OK, I think reading between the lines, that's actually quite clear. Just finally, I want to ask you a question about Keir Starmer. If he is found to have broken COVID laws by Durham police, if he's issued with a fixed penalty notice, does he need to resign?
Well, I think it's absolutely vital for public trust that these allegations are investigated. I'm sure they will be investigated thoroughly, and I hope they'll be investigated quickly as well. But what I think is really important to remember is that there was only one man who wrote these rules that separated families at these key moments of children's births and people's deaths. And really, it was Boris Johnson who wrote those rules, who was on TV screens every single night telling us we had to follow them or people's lives would be lost. And it's Boris Johnson who wrote the rules, broke the rules, and is now subject to 3 different investigations.
OK, Daisy Cooper, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Daisy Cooper there. Well, let's turn back to the Conservative Party and the performance in those local elections, because there will, of course, be plenty of Conservative MPs who are looking forwards and considering whether or not Boris Johnson's the right person to lead the party, how the party resets itself after some of those disappointing results across the country. Let's talk now to Tom Tugendhat, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, shall we? He holds the seat of Tonbridge and Malling in Kent. Dominic Raab described the results as a mixed bag. Is that a bit complacent?
No, I don't think it's complacent. I think it's a pretty accurate description, but it's a pretty big blow for 400 and something of our friends who have stood as Conservative councillors. And I tell you, I was campaigning in places like Cumberland and Wandsworth, and people like Ravi Govinda, who have devoted, frankly, a lifetime to serving the people of Wandsworth, and people like John Mallinson up in Carlisle who've done similarly for our community there. It's phenomenal. It's a real tragedy.
I just want to talk specifically about what's happening in the south. You represent Tonbridge and Malling. In Kent, it's exactly the kind of area where the Conservatives did badly. Neighbouring Tunbridge Wells, for example, losing control of that council election. Just looking now at the Conservatives losing support in the south, down 5.9%, that average change in vote share in the south, and mainly at the expense of the Liberal Democrats. Why do you think so many people in southern England are turning against the Conservatives?
Well, you spoke to David Simmons and that came up a bit, but I have to say one of the things that came up even more for me in the south of England was planning. And, we need to address the fact that the Garden of England cannot become the patio of England. We need to make sure that communities across the United Kingdom have a say in what's built near them. By the way, for many people, that means building more because people want their friends and children and family to come and live near them. But people do need to have control of their lives. And I think that's one of the things that these elections have really pushed hard as well, because a lot of the issues that have come forward have not been the national issues that you have been quite understandably talking about, but a lot of them have been down to local issues. I mean, I can certainly tell you that in places like Tunbridge Wells, a lot of the issues have been down to very local planning decisions, which people feel have gone out of their control.
At the same time, though, I just wonder, I spoke to David Gauke yesterday as well, and he was saying that he's got concerned that by effectively leaning in to some of the issues that he believes are relevant in the red wall seats, Brexit, culture wars, Boris Johnson has been alienating some of the voters in his more traditional blue shires, if you like. Do you think that that is true?
Well, I mean, you can talk about different emphasis if you like. I mean, I think British people across the entire United Kingdom want the same thing from leadership. They want integrity, they want clarity, they want honesty. I mean, I don't think these are red wall or southeast or northeast or whatever issues. These are national issues, and I think people want the same. But
okay,
I think
integrity
one of the most
and honesty. Integrity and honesty is Partygate coming up quite a lot then?
Well, it's coming up a lot in Parliament. Look, I mean, there's some people who've taken money off Chinese people who've now been shown to be Chinese agents. That's the Lib Dems. There's some people who are now being investigated for various different things. That's Labour. This is going across. And frankly, a lot of us have had enough of it. It's not that hard to remember that the people we all serve are the British people, not ourselves. And I do find it somewhat frustrating sometimes to hear the cant from other sides of the chamber and to watch what's going on. But it's also, Daisy quite understandably said these are Boris's rules on COVID. Well, she voted for them. I didn't hear her opposition during that. This was pretty much the entire Parliament voted for it. Only a few of us rebelled on various things.
I think Daisy's point, to be fair, wasn't about the COVID rules themselves, but the fact that Boris Johnson made the rules and then broke the COVID rules. And that's the question that I asked you. The question that I asked you was whether or not that's coming up on the doorstep. So I'm not totally sure why we're talking about Chinese agents and the Lib Dems, but how bad an issue on the doorstep has Partygate been?
So you asked me about integrity, and you're right to ask me about integrity because it really matters. Serving the British people properly and remembering that this is a duty and a service, not some sort of joyride, is absolutely essential. But that applies across the entire House. And I'm afraid what has been so frustrating in the last few years is how many people across the whole House seem to have forgotten that. I'm not defending anybody. I'm not attacking anybody in particular. I'm just pointing out that this is something that has become an issue for the entire Parliament, and I think we need to sort it out.
Is Boris Johnson still an electoral asset to the Conservative Party?
Well, it depends on the voter. I mean, there are plenty of people who still support him very closely. And, in Tunbridge and Malling, I can tell you I get letters in support of him. I get letters against him. And that's not exactly surprising. He's always been a divisive character, and he's always been somebody who's communicated his message extremely clearly. And you can choose which one of those skills or which one of those assets you think is most beneficial. But, we can focus, if you like, on the internal politics. But the most important thing that happened on Thursday wasn't Boris Johnson. The most important thing that happened on Thursday was the result in Northern Ireland and the Bank of England's announcement that we may well be going into recession. And I have to say, those are the two things that are going to be occupying my mind as we go forward, because holding the union together and protecting our economy, and therefore protecting the British people in both senses, I think is absolutely fundamental.
So what do you want to see from the government in relation to those, as you say, extremely important issues next week when the Queen's speech happens?
Well, the first one on Northern Ireland, I think it's to listen to the people of Northern Ireland. We have had a very, very long-standing principle embedded in various different elements of the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement, that the consent of the people of Northern Ireland is the paramount decider of the outcome of different events there. And so we do need to listen, and that means listening to people on the east-west trade and on the north-south trade. Now, I think we can resolve this, but it requires goodwill and cooperation, certainly across the island of Ireland and across the European Union and across the United Kingdom. And I think lowering the tension is extremely important there. The second element on the economy, I think there's an awful lot that we can do. I mean, I wasn't a supporter of the rise in national insurance, and I think there are many other areas where we should be looking at how we can ease the burden on the British people, because as we go into a period where the Bank of England is telling us there's going to be slow growth, and the Bank of England is telling us already that inflation is running or about to run at somewhere near 10%, and various banks are telling us in private that for the lower down for those poorer in our community, those who are struggling more in our community, it's already running higher than that, 10-15%. We really do need to be looking at this, because this is about serving the entire community and making sure that people have what they need to survive what is going to be likely to be a very difficult time.
You've previously said that you would run for the leadership if Boris Johnson was to go. Is that still your position?
Well, I've made it very clear. In fact, I think I'm the only person who's made it very clear that I think serving our country at every level is an enormous honour. I've been lucky enough to serve in uniform, to serve as a diplomat, and now to serve in Parliament. And I hope, I'll be able to serve in many different ways. And one of the ways, of course, I'd like to serve our country as, in a position that gives me influence over things that I think really matter. Of course, that's what I want to do. I came into Parliament because I thought that ideas matter, that our country matters, and our communities matter. And I hope to serve a long time yet.
Like you said in January, as you were mentioning there, I think it's a position of absolute integrity to say that, of course, you should offer yourself to the electorate if you think you can do it. Of course, you should talk to colleagues and see if you can get a group together. And if you can get a group together, you should go for it. Have you been talking to colleagues?
Not particularly, no. I mean, the real thing I've been doing at the moment is dealing with the issues that you're about to talk about when you speak to the Finnish ambassador. I've spent an awful lot of time speaking to people in Sweden and indeed Finland and across the Viking territories, if you like, the northern states, to discuss both the NATO element that I hope you're going to be discussing with the Finnish ambassador, which I must say I'm very, very pleased that the Finns have taken this decision or look likely to take this decision. But I'm also talking about different ways of working with our European partners. For example, youth mobility schemes are not specifically covered by the European Union. We can have them separately. The Canadians have a separate one with Sweden. Why can't we? There's various elements that I'd like to look at working with different countries in different ways, because I think international outreach is absolutely essential to our future. And I think Britain is uniquely placed to be a network power that brings people together. So I'm afraid that's where I've been putting my focus.
OK. Tom Tugendhat, thank you very much indeed for being on the programme today. Tom Tugendhat there. Well, we were just talking there about the interview with the Finnish ambassador that we're about to go to now. And we were, of course, saying, the war in Ukraine and the utter misery it's creating is more than 2 months old now. The Ukrainian president says that any peace deal must involve Russian forces totally pulling back to pre-invasion positions, as the latest resistance in Mariupol seems on the verge of defeat. And, of course, it means that other countries in Europe are reassessing their own security, with Sweden and Finland apparently on the brink of historic applications to join NATO. Well, we're joined now by Finland's ambassador to the UK, that is Jukka Siukosaari. Thank you very much for being with us. So there has been reports that May the 12th is the date that Finland will decide to apply to NATO. Is that right?
Well, that date is important, and thank you for having me in the programme. The President of Finland has said that by the May 12th, he will make his opinion public. We started this democratic process almost immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it has been a very thorough parliamentary procedure with a report from the government to the parliament on the options. And indeed, applying for NATO membership is one of the options. So on the 12th, things are moving. They have been moving, of course, already before that, with various political parties stating their opinions, and indeed MPs. We have 200 members of parliament coming out to the public and saying openly what they think about it.
You've obviously never felt the need to apply to join NATO before. What's changed?
I have to go a little bit back on history, actually almost 1,000 years. We were part of the Swedish kingdom for 6 centuries. Then we were part of the Russian Empire as an very autonomous Grand Duchy. So we have throughout all of our history been between East and the West. And Finland has often been sort of dragged into conflicts that we had very little ownership of, that had very little to do with Finland, but more with the big power politics. And that is why the Finns have had a very pragmatic approach to military alignment. We haven't seen it as a necessity. We might have been even suspicious about it. But now, with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which we completely condemn and which the Finnish population doesn't understand at all and doesn't accept, the political climate and the popular opinion has changed.
This week, your foreign ministry has said a Russian army helicopter violated Finland's airspace. How concerned are you about aggression from Russia?
When it comes to violations of airspace, we have had plenty of those before during the past years, when we always react to them and we demand an explanation. That is not new. We are also quite prepared for any other type of influence or influence attempts from Russia during the process of application, if we decide to start it. We have invested in our preparedness, and I don't mean only defense, but the sort of whole of society approach, comprehensive security, for decades. And I think we are quite well prepared for different types of influence, including cyber, hybrid, or indeed violations of our territory.
There's obviously a border between Finland and Russia. We've all seen the atrocities that have happened in Ukraine. Frankly, if you're not a member of NATO, is Finland feeling vulnerable?
I wouldn't say vulnerable is the word. We are concerned. We are very concerned for the security structure of Europe that we have built our security around. But as I said, we have been investing in our own national defense for decades. We have quite a robust defense force, both the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. So in that sense, we are not overly worried. What we are concerned about is what this attack and this war will mean to the European security structure in the future. And therefore, we have taken this opportunity to consider our route forward, and we shall see where the parliamentary and the democratic decisions lead us.
Are you confident that if you did apply to join NATO, that you would be accepted? Reports that the Croatian president saying that he would actually veto any application.
We are following very carefully the discussion in different major countries, and embassies, including my own, have been tasked to find out what the political climate in each and every member state is. For the part of the UK, I can say, and that was also repeated by Tom Tugendhat just a couple of minutes ago, that the British support is very clear. So we have absolutely no concerns about Britain whatsoever. Each member state, and there are 30 of those in NATO, is a case of its own. And of course, we are looking at each and every one of them. But at the moment, I wouldn't say that we have particular concerns of any of them.
What are you prepared to contribute to NATO if you were to become members?
Certainly. We take our memberships in any organization very seriously. Finns are a rule-obeying nation and a country. We have a strong national defense, so I think our inclusion in NATO would strengthen the security situation around the Baltic Sea. We are also an extremely solid democracy, the least corrupt country in the world. And in some fields of technology, including mobile networks, artificial intelligence, quantum intelligence, we are ahead of the field, you might say. So I think we have lots to contribute.
And just finally, obviously the importance of NATO has really been highlighted with the war in Ukraine, but there has been criticism of NATO previously by many different people, of course, that it's too aggressive, that it's provoked Russia by moving troops. Do you accept any of those criticisms of how NATO has been?
I think we see NATO as a defense alliance, and of course, when you plan for defense, you have to prepare for different alternatives. But I don't think we in Finland see that NATO and indeed NATO member states can be in any way blamed for what has happened in Ukraine. That was a Russian aggression against a sovereign neighboring state and completely unwarranted and uncalled for.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Really interesting to talk to you there. Jukka, Siukosaari, thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.
Well, it's been a busy show for us today after a busy couple of days with those local elections as well. A quick reminder, our weekly podcast is available every week. Highlights of the interviews and some thoughts from the teams here. I think there'll be quite a lot of thoughts, to be honest. I feel like I've been just in the mine of those local election results, and it'd be quite nice to kind of decompress on the podcast in a moment. That will be available wherever you get your podcast from. Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. In a moment after the break, we'll be running through today's interview, seeing what we learned with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Thank you very much for joining us this Sunday morning. Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge, The Take, where we'll reflect on what we've just heard over the last hour, focusing, of course, on the election results, the implications of Sinn Féin winning in Northern Ireland and Big 8. And among our guests were the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy and the Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems, Daisy Cooper. Well, it has been quite a show, but also quite a few days. I've been brought a cup of tea in the break by the floor manager, which I feel is quite needed to kind of decompress slightly after what's been going on. We're also joined, of course, by our Deputy Political, Sam Coates, who's on hand to help us analyse the interviews and also the results, Sam. I mean, you've had quite a few days as well, haven't you? Where do you think we are after the local elections, Sam? What's your sort of main sort of takeaways?
Well, elections always throw up surprises. They always prove to be significant, perhaps in ways that we didn't expect. And the agenda is extremely long this morning. First up, those election results really now bring the question of the union of the United Kingdom right back into the fore. You've got the twin issues in Northern Ireland of whether or not they could, in the next few years, should elections be going in the right way, be a border poll. In other words, the question would be put to the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland whether or not Northern Ireland should be reunited with the Republic or whether it should stay part of the United Kingdom. Allied with that, intertwined with that, is now the question of what happens with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So those two things are on the agenda in Northern Ireland. Then you move to Scotland. Up in Scotland, what was really striking is it was again the nationalists for the fifth set of local elections in a row who put on seats really quite a phenomenal task for an organisation, for a political party that's 15 years in government. And then I think the local election results in England and in Wales threw up more surprises. We sat in the studio that you're in on Wednesday, Sophie, and I said then I just wonder whether for Labour and the Conservatives, both party leaders end up coming out with a bloody nose. And frankly, for various reasons, for various different results around the country, the Tories looking like their heartlands are somewhat straining, that they were losing support there. For Labour, for its inability to make bigger progress, I think that Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson have emerged with a bloody nose. So it's been really quite a revealing few days and a revealing set of results.
Like you say, Sam, it's almost like you just don't know what to talk about because there are so many things that have such big consequences. And we'll be with Sam, of course, as the programme goes on. But it does feel like the place that we should start is on what happens with Northern Ireland, because there are some really, really big questions, of course, thrown up by those set of results, not least if the DUP are even prepared to enter a power-sharing arrangement at all, or if they're prepared to collapse the executive because they're so unhappy, I should say, about that Northern Ireland Protocol. Well, it was the first thing that I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, about. He said the government is focused on unlocking the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. He wants to see it fixed quickly, otherwise there won't be stability in Northern Ireland.
We prefer to get it resolved through negotiation. That's why we've been through a protracted period to try and get it fixed through negotiation. But of course, as you know, there are measures that we can take to make sure that we deal with the problem. We can't put it off. And it's clear now, and in fact, if anything, the outcome in Northern Ireland from those elections makes it clear it can't be put off. And
you say it can't be put off. What kind of timeframe are we talking about here?
Well, I don't want to jump the gun because then that will lead all the headlines. I think it needs to be dealt with very responsibly. But we've been talking about...
Are you talking weeks? Are we talking months?
No longer than that. 58% fully of people voted either for parties who support the union or for parties who do not support constitutional change. And that is the message from the people of Northern Ireland.
But what is the UK government position on a border poll?
Well, look, we don't have an executive yet.
So I feel like in the kind of carefully couched language that all Westminster politicians use when talking about Northern Ireland, he's pushing back slightly on the idea that there could be a border poll there. But I think the immediate thing in the in tray of the government here in Westminster is that Northern Ireland Protocol, because although they're trying to say it's all about how it's implemented, clearly it is Boris Johnson's Brexit deal that he signed, and there will be some in the DUP who feel that they were misled by the Prime Minister over what that meant. Well, let's bring in our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, shall we? Dominic Raab didn't want to be drawn into how soon it could, in his words, be fixed. But they're going to have to act quite quickly on this, aren't they?
Yes, Tuesday actually will be a signal of the start of action. Let me explain what's going on, because politicians don't like to preempt Queen's speeches. But what's essentially been decided by Boris Johnson's government is that they are going to pick yet another big, high-profile, angry fight with the European Union, again over the Northern Ireland deal that Boris Johnson stuck as part of his Brexit deal. And that will kick off in the Queen's speech on Tuesday, where we understand Her Majesty is now very likely to make a reference to protecting the Good Friday Agreement in her address to Parliament. Now, that will be code for the beginning of hostilities, effectively. And what the government want to do is, yes, try and trigger another round of talks with the EU, but introduce a new element, which is the threat of legislation that will effectively scrap the Northern Ireland Protocol, which, you know, is part of a big treaty that the UK negotiated with the EU that's meant to be internationally binding. They would threaten to introduce domestic legislation simply to ignore that treaty. Now, we've been through one of these rounds before, about 18 months ago. It was called the Internal Market Bill. Britain ended up backing down. It caused enormous tension, friction, unhappiness in Europe. But it looks as if they're going to put the press the button on that one more time. Lots of sabre-rattling in the Sunday papers this morning. Lots of sources close to Liz Truss, maybe it would seem brave enough quite to come out and say things on the record, but essentially saying that the EU is interfering in the sovereign affairs of the United Kingdom. The truth is, that was the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson struck in order to ensure that there was no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is, of course, inside the European Union, and allowing there to be an exposed border on the north flank of the Republic of Ireland, and the price that was paid for that. But it's going to be messy. And one of the things I thought was most interesting is that in a later answer, the bit that you just played, Dominic Raab made clear that he just didn't think that there was a mandate further down the track for essentially a border poll, people voting in the reunification of the Republic of Ireland because of the way that people in Northern Ireland voted. But then you listen to David Blevins, Sky's Ireland correspondent, and he pointed out that there is not a majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly now, as elected on Thursday, to scrap the protocol, which is precisely the path that essentially this government is signalling it is prepared to go down. Sky's David Blevins pointed out that 54 members of the new Northern Ireland Assembly want to keep, but perhaps change, but certainly keep the Northern Ireland Protocol, where 36 new members of the newly elected members, largely the DUP, want to scrap it. Yet this is the path that the Westminster government is about to go down. So expect this to be quite high wire, expect this to be very contested, expect Europe to react very, very badly indeed. It's one of those things that some perhaps slightly more cynical people in Number 10 hope might keep some of the right flank of the Tory party on board, because there's nothing that some of them like more than a dust-up with the EU.
Yeah, it looks like it's coming, doesn't it? Dominic Raab saying that they're prepared to act unilaterally if needed. Thank you very much, Sam. Yeah, Sam was saying after those results it might be that Boris Johnson's looking for a bit of a red meat to throw to his party, and I wonder if this could be it. Well, we were also joined on the programme by the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper. Of course, the Lib Dems performed pretty well in the local elections, particularly against the Conservatives in the south of England. So I was keen to find out if the party would consider a coalition to get into government.
We want to win as many seats as possible off the Conservatives at the next general election. And one way or another, we would like to play a role in ousting this Conservative government. It's far too soon to say what that might look like or how that might work, but we would want to play a role in ousting this Conservative government. That's our number one priority.
I thought that was actually pretty clear, to be honest. With these things, often, you're expecting politicians to decide to take the question. She didn't exactly directly answer it, but I think reading between the lines, you could see that the Lib Dems see a situation where they could join forces with Labour in a hung parliament, but not the Conservatives. And it does feel like this is a relevant question, even though we're just talking about local election results, even though a general election is a long way away, potentially. Well, although, according to reports, Boris Johnson could pull the trigger slightly early. what the results point to more than anything is no party getting a majority. So it does feel like quite a relevant question to be asking. Now, we also asked Dominic Raab about the Conservative Party's losses at the polls this weekend and whether Keir Starmer should resign if he's found to have broken lockdown rules.
I've always said it's a balance. You've got to knit an alliance between the aspirational working and middle classes, but that's what we're focused on. And that's why we're the ones, as I said, with the plan for the cost of living. We're going to be talking about that this week, whereas I think you're going to find Keir Starmer wrapped up in Beergate and Durham. It's the rank double standards that drives people crazy. He needs to fess up and answer all of the holes in the account that he gave of that beer and curry event in Durham.
Well, let's bring Sam Coates back in at this point, shall we? Sam, I have to say that I thought it was probably a little bit rich for Dominic Raab to be, accusing Labour of being wrapped up in Beergate and wanting to talk too much about Beergate. He didn't at all, even though he brought it up about 3 or 4 times by my account during the interview.
Absolutely. It was almost like the Deputy Prime Minister was still in campaigning mode. There's a lot to campaign. There was a lot of campaign needed by the Conservative Party because of the prediction and predicament that they're in. But I just want to focus on that first excerpt, the comments by the Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader. I thought what she said, to put no bones about it, was really, 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 really important. Why? Right. The projections of what the local elections would look like if it was a national poll showed that we're heading towards a hung parliament. Now, Michael Thrasher, Sky's election analyst, has put some numbers on it this morning. He's done so in the Sunday Times with Colin Runnings, his colleague. And those numbers suggest that the Labour Party would be on 35% on the basis of Thursday's results. The Conservatives would be on 33%. And the Liberal Democrats would be on 17%. Storming result for the Liberal Democrats. I think both the Conservatives and the Labour Party would be pretty disappointed with that for one reason or another, as we were discussing before. But the point about that is it would be a hung parliament. And in that situation, the Liberal Democrats, possibly along with the SNP, the Liberal Democrats would be kingmaker. Now, in the past, the Liberal Democrats have kept their counsel, have not said whether or not they would put a Tory in Downing Street or a Labour Prime Minister in Downing Street. But there, on your show, you got an answer. It was an absolutely unambiguous answer, and that answer is we're gonna fight to get rid of the Tories. And effectively what that means, although unsurprisingly the Liberal Democrats don't like spelling it quite out loud like that, is they would put a Labour Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, in Downing Street in that scenario. And that is a game-changing statement, and it means that the Conservatives from now on will absolutely know, because the Liberal Democrats have committed in public on your show that they will face a combined opposition trying to get rid of them. So unless they get an overall majority, there is not going to be a Conservative in Downing Street, Boris Johnson in Downing Street after the next election. It matters enormously, and that puts more pressure on the Tories and means that that's why Dominic Raab was in campaign mode.
There you go, Sam. Really interesting to talk as ever. Time now for a quick break. After this break, we're going to have more on those claims about the Labour leader Keir Starmer and how Lisa Nandy dealt with them.
So this is a bit of a moment in time, I think. The government here in the UK is reviewing a 10-year study that it commissioned into the keeping of elephants in zoos. And the biggest elephant keeper in Britain, Damien Aspinall of Howletts, is sending all his elephants, so 25% of the entire number of elephants in the United Kingdom, to be rewilded in Kenya. The research that we've undertaken explores issues such as obesity, which is widespread, mental distress that elephants suffer, which is widespread, infant mortality, which is 40% of elephants born in captivity in the UK die before the age of 5, longevity, the fact that they don't live as long as they would naturally in the wild. There's a whole raft of evidence as to why, after keeping elephants in zoos for approximately 200 years in this country, we need to have a profound and fundamental rethink, not tinkering around the edges, baby steps. It really is time for those elephants that can go back to the wild to go back to the wild, and for those elephants that can't, to be retired to specialised sanctuaries. And that's why we're calling on George Eustace, the Secretary of State, to bring in measures that would prevent the import of further elephants, would bring the attempted breeding of elephants, and it's a pretty abysmal story when it comes to the breeding of elephants, bring that to a close, and to help find an alternative future for the rest of their lives for the elephants that we currently have.
The real catastrophe here is for wild elephants. I mean, what zoos are is part of the solution. And so whilst I acknowledge some of the facts that Will's talking about, they're spanning back over 40 years. You know, modern progressive zoos are conservation international NGOs. That's why I'm talking to you today from the Eastern Cape, you know, working in a reserve, you know, talking about elephant stocking as well as a whole range of other species. So they are modern progressive conservation centres that are an integral part of the conservation of a whole raft of species. And those species can range from orchids to snails to birds, right through to elephants, you know, and lots of the things that we're doing in zoos are now pioneering and looking at the techniques that may well be game-changing and saving for elephants.
Y con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas. Y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
Hello, welcome back to Sophy Ridge on Sunday, The Take, where we take you back through the morning's interviews with some analysis from me and our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Well, the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy was on the programme today discussing, of course, Labour's election performance, but also she found herself, obviously, answering questions about Keir Starmer and the latest Big 8 allegations. I asked her if he should resign if he's found to have broken COVID rules. Let's hear.
It lends legitimacy to something that is completely and utterly absurd, that is a desperate attempt by the government to deflect from the fact that we've got the highest inflation rate in a generation and people are struggling to survive. This is a guy who self-isolated 6 times during the pandemic. I don't know a single other person who did that. He is Mr. Rules. He does not break the rules. That call for Boris Johnson to resign was at a time when the Prime Minister was under investigation for 12 separate gatherings at Downing Street, which he denied for months had even happened, let alone that he was there, and only came clean when he was caught red-handed. That included karaoke parties, bring your own bottle parties, leaving drinks, celebration drinks, suitcases full of wine being smuggled in through the back door of Downing Street. It is absurd to equate that to a work visit with planned breaks to eat. It was not illegal to eat.
Lisa Nandy's defence there of Keir Starmer, Mr. Rules, as she called him, saying that there was no point even entertaining the thought about what would happen if he was found to have broken the rules, because it wasn't going to happen. Well, I couldn't resist asking Lisa Nandy if she'd have another crack at becoming Labour leader if an opportunity was to arise.
Look, I stood to be leader of the Labour Party because I believed that our nations and regions across Britain had been fundamentally underserved for decades, and we needed to turn that around. We need to get good jobs back into towns like Wigan and across the country, and we need to start putting money in people's pockets and rebuilding our communities. That's the job that Keir Starmer has handed me. And for 12 years, I've just watched with absolute desperation as the Tories have visited misery on people across this country.
It did sound like she was setting her stall out slightly there, talking about why she ran the first time. Well, let's bring in our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, shall we, who's on hand to help us analyse some of the morning's interviews. I can see you grinning there after the Lisa Nandy interview. What's your takeaway, Sam?
You have to understand the context, Sophie. Lisa Nandy was already on the naughty step with Keir Starmer's office because she had suggested she didn't think that he should be going on about Partygate quite so much, and I think the leader's office were pretty cross about that. I'm not sure this morning's interview will have particularly helped. Mr. Rules, that's hardly the most inspiring name you could slap on a leader. And then incredibly forward-leaning answer into your question about whether or not she'd have another go if there was a vacancy at the top of the Labour Party. Well, that drew a little bit of sharp intake of breath here in South East London, I have to say, even if she insists she was being completely loyal. Lisa Nandy always knows what she's doing. But let's return to the substance. We are on month 5 of Partygate and Beergate and its different forms, but it remains relevant. It actually remains important. There is a path to Keir Starmer having to resign. That is if Durham police find that he broke the rules on April the 30th, 2021, at an event in Durham Miners Hall where there was curry and beer at the end of a day of campaigning. Labour say they didn't break the rules, and it was all completely sort of organised to comply with the pandemic laws in place at that point. Now, overnight, this subject has returned because the Mail on Sunday published a memo detailing the day's events, and that included a reference to that curry, which perhaps Labour had implied was a spur-of-the-moment thing. Actually appears in the grid. Now, that memo, much discussed on social media and in the papers this morning. Now, controversially, having read it, I actually think it might help Keir Starmer's legal case, even if it causes some political controversy, because it makes absolutely clear that the dinner that you saw, the grainy footage of, the film footage of that we've been showing on Sky News, was pre-planned as a work event by the Labour Party as part of campaigning. Now, therefore, to make the case that it was socialising, it looked to me, became a little bit harder. So perhaps that will play in Keir Starmer's defence. But none of this is helping the Labour Party just get back on the front foot.
Really good to talk, as always, Sam. And as you say, it might be an impact where Durham Police clear Keir Starmer, and that is all there is to it. Well, that is it for Sophy Ridge on Sunday after a very busy week. We'll see you next Sunday and on Wednesday as well for The Take. Hope you tune in.